In the summer of 1960, a Boy Scout from Kansas and a Boy Scout from Denmark stepped off an aircraft onto the Greenland ice sheet, having won a magazine competition to visit the strangest building site in the world. What they found was a city under the snow. 21 trenches had been cut into the ice and roofed over with arched steel, then buried again, so that from the surface almost nothing was visible but ventilation stacks and a flagpole. Underneath ran over a mile of tunnels housing barracks for up to 200 men, a chapel, a barber shop, a theatre, a library, and, the genuine engineering marvel at the center of it, a portable nuclear reactor supplying power and heat to the entire complex. Reporters had already been through. National Geographic ran a feature. The Saturday Evening Post ran another. The official story told to the press, to the two delighted teenagers, and to the soldiers who lived there themselves, was straightforward. This was Camp Century, a U.S. Army demonstration of what Arctic engineering could achieve, and a platform for legitimate scientific research into the ice sheet. Some of that was completely true. Genuine science happened at Camp Century. Its engineers pioneered techniques for building inside a moving glacier that nobody had attempted before. And in 1966, in one of the tunnels, a team drilled all the way through the ice sheet to the bedrock beneath it and pulled up the first deep ice core ever extracted anywhere on Earth. A scientific achievement so significant that climatologists are still analyzing samples from that core today, 60 years later, using techniques that did not exist when it was drilled. This episode is a slightly different shape from most of what comes before it in this series, and it is worth naming that difference up front. The document being concealed here was not evidence of a crime already committed. It was a plan, enormous, funded, actively under construction, and the concealment was aimed not at the concealing government's own public, but at an ally. None of that was the reason the base existed. Camp Century was cover. Its real purpose was to test whether a functioning military installation, and eventually a mobile nuclear missile force, could be built and hidden inside the Greenland ice sheet, territory that did not belong to the United States, on an island governed by an American ally that had not been told what was actually being built there. The program behind it had its own name, and it did not sound like a scientific research station. It was called Project Iceworm. To understand what Iceworm was for, you have to understand the specific geography that made Greenland irresistible to American nuclear planners in the late 1950s. A ballistic missile fired from northern Greenland toward Moscow travels one of the shortest possible paths across the globe, over the pole, far shorter than a launch from the continental United States. Greenland was also, at the time, wrapped in secrecy of its own kind. Enormous, sparsely inhabited, difficult to surveil, and covered by an ice sheet more than a mile thick in places, which planners increasingly saw not as an obstacle, but as the ultimate camouflage. Soviet reconnaissance could photograph an airbase. It could not easily photograph a missile buried under snow. The plan that emerged from that thinking was audacious even by Cold War standards. Iceworm envisioned digging up to 2,500 miles of tunnels beneath the ice sheet, enough track to cover an area 3 times the size of Denmark itself, housing as many as 600 modified Minuteman missiles on rail cars that could be continuously relocated through the tunnel network, so that no single missile's position was ever fixed long enough for an enemy to target it. 60 separate launch control centers, roughly 11,000 soldiers living and working permanently under the ice to keep it running. The Army called the planned missile variant the Iceman. If Iceworm had been built as designed, it would have put a substantial fraction of America's strategic nuclear deterrent inside the sovereign territory of another country, without that country's knowledge, let alone its consent. It is worth pausing on the scale involved before moving on. 11,000 soldiers is not a covert cell or a black site. It is a standing population larger than many towns, permanently stationed underground, in a foreign country, on a project that country's own government had no visibility into. Concealment on this scale does not happen by accident. It requires a great many people, at every level of the chain, understanding exactly what they were and were not permitted to say, and to whom. Denmark had agreed to Camp Century. Denmark had not agreed to Project Iceworm, because Denmark was never told Project Iceworm existed. This is the mechanism at the center of the episode, and it is worth stating plainly before going further, because it is different in kind from an agency hiding something from its own public. This was one government hiding an enormous strategic weapons program from an allied government, on that ally's own soil, while asking that same ally to publicly vouch for the cover story. Denmark, in 1957, had adopted an official policy against hosting nuclear weapons on its territory, a position that carried real domestic political weight and that Danish officials had stated to their own parliament and public. American planners were fully aware of that policy. It is precisely why Iceworm could never be presented to Copenhagen honestly. A research station studying Arctic construction techniques was something Danish officials could approve without contradicting their own declared policy. A plan to bury 600 nuclear missiles under Greenland was not. So the Americans presented the part that could survive Danish scrutiny and built the part that could not underneath it, in the same tunnels, using the same cover story, staffed by many of the same soldiers, most of whom had no more idea than the Danish government did about what the base they were digging was ultimately meant to become. Construction on Camp Century began in 1959. Iceworm's feasibility testing ran alongside it through the early 1960s, using the tunnels, the power supply, and the engineering lessons of the Visible Research Station as its foundation. And then the ice itself refused to cooperate. There is a genuine irony worth naming here, because it recurs nowhere else in this series. In almost every other episode, physical evidence is the thing that has to be hidden or destroyed for a cover-up to work. In this one, the physical environment itself was the primary obstacle to the plan succeeding at all, not because anyone was trying to expose it, but because a mile-thick moving glacier does not particularly care what a missile planner in the Pentagon has scheduled for it. The Greenland ice sheet is not a static block. It flows, continuously, under its own weight, deforming anything built inside it. Camp Century's own tunnels began to shift within a few years of construction, walls closing in, ceilings sagging, support structures requiring constant maintenance just to keep the existing base habitable. Engineers studying the problem for Iceworm's proposed expansion concluded that a network of rail tunnels stretching thousands of miles, intended to remain stable and operational for the useful life of a missile system, was not something the ice would allow. The glacier would crush the very tunnels meant to hide the missiles moving through them. By 1963, that engineering verdict had effectively killed Project Iceworm. It was formally cancelled that year. Camp Century itself continued in a reduced capacity for a few more years, its nuclear reactor removed in 1964 amid its own separate technical concerns, and the base was fully evacuated by 1966, left to be reclaimed by the snow. The Americans packed up what they could and left the rest. Fuel, chemical waste, and construction debris were abandoned, under the assumption, standard for the era, that snowfall would simply bury it forever under an ever-thickening ice sheet that was not expected to shrink. Project Iceworm's cancellation did not mean its secrecy ended. If anything, cancellation made secrecy easier to maintain because there was no longer an active weapons program requiring further disclosure to anyone, and the paperwork could simply be filed and left alone. It stayed filed for 3 decades. The first crack came in 1996, when American documents relating to the program were declassified and became available to researchers. What those documents confirmed publicly for the first time was that Camp Century had never been merely a research station, that a genuine, funded, engineered plan to base hundreds of nuclear missiles in Greenland had existed, and that it had been kept from the Danish government throughout. The Danish reaction was not academic curiosity. It was closer to a political shock, because it touched directly on a sensitive and long-running domestic question: how much had earlier Danish governments secretly known about, or tacitly permitted, on the subject of nuclear weapons in Danish and Greenlandic territory, contrary to public policy and public assurances given to their own citizens. In response, Denmark's own government commissioned a formal investigation. The Danish Institute for International Studies conducted a detailed inquiry into the country's Cold War-era nuclear history, and in 1997 it published a report that laid out, based on the declassified American material and Danish archives, the full scope of what Project Iceworm had actually involved, confirming, in an official Danish government-commissioned document, that an Allied government had used Danish and Greenlandic territory for a large-scale secret nuclear weapons program, concealed from Denmark for decades. The confirmation did not come from an American whistleblower, or an American court, or an American journalist. It came from the ally that had been deceived, formally investigating its own government's history because its own citizens deserved to know what had actually happened beneath their own territory. That is worth sitting with. In most of the cases in this series, the cover-up is eventually unwound by someone inside the country doing the covering up. A reporter, an investigator, a court, a records clerk. Here, the reckoning belonged to the country that had been lied to, examining what its ally had done to it decades after the fact, using documents the ally itself had eventually been forced to release. It is also worth being fair to what actually happened diplomatically once the 1997 report was published. There was no formal rupture between Washington and Copenhagen over Iceworm's exposure. Denmark absorbed the finding as a matter of historical reckoning with its own Cold War governments, rather than as grounds for a rupture with a NATO ally it continued to rely on for its own security. That restraint is itself part of the story. It says something about how much latitude Allied governments were, and often still are, willing to extend to secrecy conducted in the name of a shared deterrent. There is a coda to this story, and it did not require any further declassification at all. It required a thermometer. Camp Century's abandoned infrastructure, fuel, PCBs and other contaminants, along with low-level radioactive coolant water left behind when the reactor was removed, was buried on the assumption that Greenland's ice sheet would only ever get thicker, sealing the waste away permanently under new accumulating snow. Climate research published in the 21st century overturned that assumption entirely. Studies modeling the Greenland ice sheet's response to warming temperatures have concluded that meltwater at the site is likely to begin reaching some of the buried material within decades rather than centuries, far sooner than the engineers of the 1960s ever anticipated, driven by a rate of Arctic warming that Cold War planners had no reason to expect, and no model that predicted it. A program built on the assumption that ice was permanent camouflage is now being unwound by the discovery that the ice itself was never as permanent as everyone involved had assumed. So here is where this one lands, and it sits differently from most of what has come before it. Nothing here was burned, shredded, or fought over between rival agencies. The concealment was structural, built directly into the shape of the cover story from day one. A real, publicized, internationally reported research station with real scientists and real achievements, deliberately used as camouflage for a program so much larger that revealing it would have violated a formal policy commitment made by an Allied government to its own people. It worked for as long as the weapons program itself existed, and it kept working for another 3 decades after the program was already dead, purely because nobody outside a small circle in Washington had any reason to go looking for something that had already been quietly cancelled and packed away under the snow. Everything anyone needed to know sat, undisturbed, in American classified files for 30 years, not because it was especially well hidden, but because the cover story was so complete and so genuinely impressive on its own terms that almost nobody thought to ask what else might be buried underneath a research station that had, by every public account, already told its whole story.